Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Bill Brenner, and I'm going to be your moderator for the next hour and a half. I work for Akamai. I blog for Dark Reading, Liquid Matrix, do another blog on the side called the OCD Diaries. Glad to be here. And I'm glad to be here with my friends here who have differing views on the role of government in cyber warfare. And you've probably seen on your chair the "It's not cyber war, it's cyber war" tags. So feel free to wear the one that you are more in agreement with. I'm going to launch right in, but I want to say that while it's a debate, I want you to feel free to break in at any time with questions, with opinions. It's all good, as long as it's civil, and it will be. So what I want to do now is let my friends introduce themselves, and Brennan, start with you.
Cool. So hi. So I'm Brendan. I'll do a little bit later when I start speaking. So as you mentioned, we are doing a formal debate, right? So we have a resolution. The resolution is resolved, or this conference stands resolved, for those of you who did high school debate, you'll recognize this format, that the current state of the internet represents a de facto cyber war, and that it is the role of governments to prosecute such wars. So it's a two-part thing. My friend, Dr. Linwood Griffin, is representing the affirmative side, that this is totally true and it's cyber war and military should get out there. And I'm saying, no, not so much. So you guys have three big roles, right? The first role is that we need your participation to call us to task. And that is going to be in several different things, but one of the cool ways is that we have our own hashtag just for this talk. So you obviously use the hashtag SourceBoston, SRCBOS, but we also have, as you notice on the ribbons, hashtag cybering, because it turns out that nobody was using that and it's not going to get unfunny anytime soon. So if you'd like to ask questions, Bill, as the moderator, is going to be looking for the best questions to come off of Twitter. He'll probably also allow random questions from the audience as well, but if you have something you don't necessarily want to shout it out, put it on hashtag cybering. We'll make sure to see it, and it's good. Also, comments that one of the moderators, or like one of the two speakers is boring, and the other one is hopefully less boring, whatever you'd like. That you just like blue better than red.
Though as moderator, I'll tell them if they're boring as we go.
Exactly. Second, we need your participation at the end, because we're actually going to have a vote, which means for the first time that I can remember, somebody runs this chance of losing a conference talk, which I think is a fabulous idea. And I'm proposing we're going to have it on your resume or CV, like in the Baseball Hall of Fame with steroids, right? So if you lose the conference talk, you have to put a little asterisk next to the talk, and at the bottom, lost. If later on we could expand this to all talks, so that if more than half the audience dislikes you at the end of your talk, you get a little star too. But exactly. But or schmooballs. But for today, we'll just do this. Third, and finally, we're going to allow heckling, which is going to be fun.
Are you sure about that?
I am. And the way we're going to do it, for those, how many of you have ever seen Prime Minister's Questions? The funniest thing on this British C-SPAN? No, nobody. Okay, so the way this works is very simple. In British Parliament, you can yell at other people when you don't like them, which is amazing. So if you like the idea, exactly. If you like the idea, you can shout, "Hear, hear," or you can pound the table, or you can, if you've asked nicely, pound the person in front of you to make a nice resonating sound, right? If we were in the ballroom and everybody had tables, it'd be cool. And if you don't like it, shame or hiss at them or whatever, boo, right? The moderator is here, of course, to keep you all within some semblance of order and dignity, or whatever seems good at the moment.
And the moderator is here to tell you that it's his turn to...
Seems good.
Aha! So now for the non-boring one to come up and talk for a little bit. So I'm John Griffin. I'm delighted to be here. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak this side of the equation today. Before I get started, I need to make the standard corporate disclaimer that you've been hearing all week. I work for TripAdvisor. They're here in the local Boston area. TripAdvisor was happy to give me the day off to come speak today, but they wanted me to make sure to let you know that they don't have an official position for or against cyber warfare. I'm here speaking on my own behalf. So Brendan laid out what it is that I would like you to vote in the affirmative for. The state of the internet is de facto cyber war, and it is the responsibility of governments to prosecute such wars. I think there's a couple of very interesting things that fall out of that affect us directly as security practitioners, but also affect the way that our governments are going to execute cyber warfare in the future, which is why I think it's important for us to agree that this is in fact the case, so that we can use that going forwards. As I was preparing for this talk, I ran it by my colleagues and everybody laughed at me and said cyber warfare, like that's just, that's a buzzword, that's a meaningless term. I'm not trying to be sensationalistic with the use of the word cyber warfare. The tagline for this part of the talk could be, if it quacks like a duck, it's a duck, right? Cyber war is warlike actions in the electronic domain, and in particular, war is in the eye of the beholder. Yes, sir.
Here, here. Can you define war in this instance then?
I absolutely can. That's a fabulous segue to point 1B on my notes here, which is that war is when a nation acts with intent to violate the sovereignty of another nation.
Here, here.
Excellent. So I have one of the 30 of you agreeing with me. In about 15 minutes, I should have another 29 of you. This will be great. So I'm going to give some examples of war as we know it, and then war as we know it in the cyber domain. Obviously, there are things that have physical impact. If you're in Eastern Europe and you drive tanks across the national border in order to acquire more territory, that's pretty obviously an act of war. If you, in the physical domain with cyber stuff, if you launch the Stuxnet attack and purportedly cause physical damage to another nation's uranium enrichment facilities in a way that set back their program by several years or by several months, that is, by any definition of warfare, that is an attack, right? That is something that the other nation could respond to as an act of war. There are other things that aren't just physical. If we think about economic impacts, undercutting an economy by systematically stealing trade secrets through spies, or perhaps by inhibiting the use or trade of a country's currency by putting counterfeit notes out there, or by causing it to tank on the international markets. These are things that could be considered acts of war, right? You're violating that other nation's sovereignty. And in the cyber domain, theft of intellectual property is a very obvious one, right? There are people who do it sort of piecemeal, but if it is the stated goal or even the unstated goal of a government that we are going to steal all of some other country's trade secrets and we're going to use that to bolster our own economy, that to me crosses the line into the definition of war, violating the sovereignty, and in particular causing a lasting harm to the people of that country, to the economy of that country, and basically making it an unequal playing field. So we've got physical impacts, we've got economic impacts. You can think of political warlike actions. For example, if you assassinate the leader of another country to try to cause a change of government to something that's more favorable to your government, that could be considered an act of war. In the cyber domain, you could, we haven't seen examples of this to my knowledge, but you could hack into voting machines and you could cause a change in the outcome of an election. You could hack into Gmail in order to expose the Secretary of State's emails, and then that was the only joke I had. I prepared that one in advance. And so you can think of ways that you can try to either blackmail people or influence the politics or the geopolitics of another nation, again, in a way that's violating their sovereignty. And the important aspect of this is these seem innocuous, but again, war is in the eye of the beholder, right? If I walk across the Canadian border with a gun, I'm a crackpot, right? That's not an act of war by the United States. But if you go back 20 or 30 years, if you're Korean Airlines Flight 007, and was that correct? Was it Korean Airlines? Yeah. And there's a time of heightened international tensions, and you fly off course, penetrating Soviet airspace several times to the extent that they believe that it's a NATO exercise, and they shoot the plane down. To the Soviets, that's a totally justified thing to do. It was a warlike action, right? And we respond to acts of war with other actions that are physical in nature and in violence. And so that's I think part of the critical aspect of this argument that the state of the internet is de facto cyber war, is that it looks like cyber war to the people that are being attacked. There was a very fascinating article that I read that was published a year ago, and I'll talk more about this later in the talk, but the author was describing the difference between network attack and network exploitation as they're used for United States cyber operations, operations in cyberspace in the military domain. If you look up the Wikipedia article on this, it talks about, everyone talks about the United States because every other country is very secretive about what they do, whereas the United States is actually somewhat open about the things that it's doing, and so there's Wikipedia articles on what it does. And the person was describing that there's what's known as network attack, which is you're actually going in and disrupting, denying, degrading, all the D words, somebody else's ability to use their computer systems or deleting the data or something like that. And then there's the separate concept of network exploitation, where you are going in, doing reconnaissance, doing spying, trying to pull secrets out, trying to get a tactical advantage over the adversary by learning what they know without letting them know that you know it. And the author of that article, and I agree with this, stated that exploitation, even though it's spying and that it seems innocuous, is actually attack from the point of view of the people being exploited. If you see somebody on your network, you don't know why they're there. There's no attribution. And there's people from companies in this room that can help with the problem, but most places don't hire you companies. And so it forces you as the recipient of this to treat it as seriously as possible. And if we're thinking about response on a national scale, it can force the government to treat it as an act of war. And I've talked about physical, economic, political impact. There's obviously things like weapons of mass destruction. Right? The United States has stated that if you attack the U.S. with nuclear, biological, or chemical agents, that the official response of the United States is we're going to deploy nuclear weapons in response. Right? Anything that falls into the weapons of mass destruction, we're going to use nuclear weapons as a response to that. And those are viewed as sort of equivalent in class type stuff. There's I'm not going to dive into what it would mean to have a weapon of mass destruction in the cyber domain. We can talk about that in the question section if you want, but I wanted to bring that up to say there are levels below that, right? And so there was news three years ago or so, back to the Iranian nuclear program, that somebody was assassinating Iranian nuclear physicists on their way to work. They would just disappear, or they would be shot, or something like that. And the speculation in the news was that there was another country that was not happy with the Iranian nuclear effort, and that country viewed it as preparation for war, for nuclear war, or for some sort of threat. And so they decided to take the action of killing that person, right, that they viewed this thing of working to enrich uranium equals something that I should fire a gun or drop a missile or something like that, drop a bomb, shoot a missile, and that these are equivalent concepts. And that's one of the points that I wanted to convey in this first part is, if these actions are cyber war, if certain of these actions are cyber war, let's say if, I use the Canadian example, if someone tries to hack the Bank of America or denial of service them, they're a crackpot. But if a group of hackers, let me get this right, if a group of hackers using non-trivial techniques infiltrate commodities trading networks and cause the effect of disrupting or degrading that market's ability to function, what might be viewed as a legitimate response by the state in which those markets operate, right? By the same token, they might say, that's pretty serious, right? You have attacked us in the cyber domain. You have caused damage, right? You have affected our data. You have affected our people. You have affected our quality of life. That is a clear and present danger to our national security. We're going to respond in like kind, but instead of in the cyber domain with physical stuff. And that, to me, is what I think is the most interesting implication for us, for the people in this room, for the people in this conference, for people who consider themselves to be cyber practitioners, that if the state of the internet is cyber war according to these descriptions, then for one, certain participants can be legitimate targets of warfare. But even if you're not being assassinated by another country, a state bears responsibility for the actions of its actors, or the people that are acting on its behalf. And so even if you're not going to be targeted for assassination, you might be targeted for prosecution if you're doing something that gets your country in hot water in the international market, if you know the United States wants to show that they're being tough on crime, then they might, yes.
So I'm going to break in here because in the spirit of letting people dive in right from the get-go, we have a tweet that has come in.
Oh, outstanding.
The pro-cyber war speaker at Source Boston has drank too much marketing Kool-Aid. You knew that was coming. So you've been up here and you've laid it out in careful detail. What do you say to folks who, I mean, this is run-of-the-mill, somebody on the other side doesn't agree with what you're saying, therefore.
Well, I mean, I think that Dr. O'Connor is going to be getting up here in about 5 minutes and is going to be able to go into great depth on the ways in which my argument might have holes in it.
Yep.
I would say that for those that consider me the pro cyber war speaker, give me another 10 minutes.
That's not encouraging. You're sounding more politician all the time.
So, for full disclosure, I actually work for the marketing department of TripAdvisor, and so I appreciate the fact that it...
See, I kind of suspected it was an insider having a little fun, so.
So,
Based on your argument, how does the U.S. government bring kinetic action against Anonymous for bringing down MasterCard?
So the broader point, and I guess I'll give you the money shot at the end and then try to go back and fill it in. Right, the main point I want to get to here in point 2C.1 is if you're doing cyber warfare furtively, you're doing it wrong. I've already described that it's burdensome and inaccurate and sometimes impossible to determine the intent of malicious activity on your network, and in the case of anonymous attacking, then that can make it challenging. But one of the things that concerns me about cyber warfare, I used to be a government contractor for about 10 years before taking my current job. I'm no longer working in security, and I went to visit the Air Force Research Lab about 10 years ago. They were working on a program called Cybercraft. This was in Rome, New York, and the Cybercraft program, which was unclassified, was this. The idea was that it was the agent, right? This was the Air Force, right? And so you can imagine a drone or a plane or something flying around doing things. The idea was this is the drone or the plane in the cyber domain, right? You can put the payload into it, or you can have it act as an agent to do information gathering or to take whatever effects you want. And several of the speakers that were there, including the highest ranking people from the government side, talked very deeply about battle damage assessments and what it meant in the context of cyber warfare. That it turns out that if you're, at least in the US military, and I assume this is the case for most militaries worldwide, if you want to take an action of some kind, if you want to drop a bomb, you can't just go grab the biggest bomb out of your arsenal and drop it. You have to say, what is the effect that we want to have? What is the way that we can accomplish that effect with minimum civilian casualties, right? With minimum collateral damage, and yet still, achieve the military aim that it is that we're going for. And part of the claim of the internet being at a state of de facto cyber war is we have all of the detriments of having the war with none of the advantages of the processes that are in place to protect people who are not combatants and to protect people who are ordinary citizens trying to lead their lives. I had some funny quote in here that if people want to fight each other on the network, that's fine as long as I can continue to get my cat videos off of YouTube without being interrupted in that. And so I'm not standing up here saying that war is great. I think war is the worst, right? If anything, the only point of war should be to get all sides back to a state where they can engage diplomatically to try to resolve the differences between them. But we want it to be war. Because if it's war, that means there are rules that all sides have to follow. That means that people who are...
all sides follow those rules.
Sure, and I can't fix that, but that means that there are... And so an example I wanted to give was there's nothing special about the word cyber, right? Just because it's happening in the cyber domain, there's still... it can still be owned by somebody. It can still affect people. If you think a cruise ship going in international waters, just because it's in international waters doesn't mean that you can go like sink the cruise ship or extort the people that are on it or take it hostage or anything like that.
No, that's the Somalis.
That's covered underneath the UN something convention of the, I'm not a maritime expert, right? But it is covered under international law, and multiple countries, and in the piracy example outside of Somalia, multiple countries come together to act as an anti-bad force in that area to try to get commerce back up, to try to get civilian protections back up to the state they were before the piracy started. And so I think that's the core reason why I'm up here advocating for, again, the resolution is the state of the internet is de facto cyber war, and it's the responsibility of governments, it's the role of governments to prosecute such wars, is if we define it as war, then we're going to be better off than we are right now. And again, not everything is cyber war, but if there is a government, a country that is sustainedly trying to violate the sovereignty of another nation, and in the specific example you gave, if there are people who can be attributed to, even if there's a larger anonymous effort or something that's not that, then that should have repercussions for the people that are doing it and for the country that is allowing it or advocating it or sustaining it.
But typically the definition of war is some sort of action between two governments, two nation states. In the case of Anonymous, they're not a nation state. In fact, they're divided across pretty much the planet.
So I think this is probably a very good time for me to turn the floor over to Dr. O'Connor so that he can go into exactly those points.
So Brennan, why don't you come on up?
Sure thing.
And I think, you brought up a good point, and one of the things that kept going through my mind is when we classify this a certain way and we're kind of giving the government the green light to act accordingly, I think the concern that I hear a lot from people is that the government then goes to the throat and overreaches, and things that are in fact not cyber warfare become cyber warfare. So
I think that's one of the major concerns that I'm going to raise here. So perfect, good segue.
please do.
Exactly. So hi, I'm Brendan. Dr. O'Connor is one of those terrifying things. I'm actually a lawyer, which is technically a doctorate, but we don't call it that because it makes us look like jerks. My bio is long. My bio is both long and odd, so I will summarize. I'm a hacker caught between worlds. I'm a lawyer, and so you all spent 20 minutes yesterday at the first keynote listening to how awful I totally was. Is somebody hissing with the microphone? No, it's just a hissing sound, weirdly. And obviously I'm not your lawyer. I did 2 cyber fast tracks and yet still ended up a consultant, not a product developer. I still think drink every time somebody says cyber, even though that's what this talk is about. And I am, just to confirm all the horrible things you already think about lawyer, I am in fact a CISP. And my only excuse that I have is I was young and needed the money. So I have 3 major points in opposition to this resolution. The first is that war is a very precise, specific thing under international law, whose definition nothing on the internet meets currently. Second, that rampant criminality calls for a police response, not a military response. And the third, that allowing the military to declare cyber as a new battlefield to meet land, sea, and sky will destroy our fragile little village to save it. And since you and I are the villagers on the internet, that's gonna suck. So first, what is war under international law? Look, war is hell, right? War, all is fair in love and war. We hear lots of things involving the word war, and so people have this general nebulous sense that war means just bad things, or as Dr. Griffin pointed out, war is when a country violates another country's sovereignty. That last part, taken literally, is almost correct, but not quite. A war is when a sovereign state decides that it hates another country very, very much, and sends its military forces, that is the people in that country, designated to act as the weaponized arm of the country, to invade the sovereignty of another country. That doesn't mean they have to physically invade, you can fly over and drop bombs or whatever, but that's the general idea. Under the primary definition of the Geneva Conventions, a war strictly requires 2 sovereign nation states, at least 2. It can't be a war between one sovereign nation state and anything else. It especially can't be when the anything else is a noun, like terrorism, or cyber, or drugs, or poverty, or when it's past participle, or whatever. You can't have war on things that aren't a country. Extraordinarily recently in legal terms, which means 50 years ago to the rest of the world, some people decided we should actually expand this a little bit. And they expanded it a little bit. And the United States ignored it. But everybody else has signed on to the first optional protocol, which expanded it to include essentially civil wars. At the time, they were thinking of the Spanish Civil War. If you haven't taken European history recently, think of the American Civil War that works essentially the same way. The idea in this definition is that both sides have to claim sovereignty, that is, they have to say that they're a legitimate government of their people, and they have to hold territory from which they launch their attacks, which makes them kind of country-like, right? This allows you to say things like Crimea can be a semi-sovereign thing, or the eastern Ukraine can be a war, without having to go into whether it's really Russia or not. Here, TLDR, it is, but we don't have to worry about that issue, because we can just say it's a war, because there's a territory from which they're launching attacks. Notice what these definitions don't include. They do not include attacks from random dudes on the internet, even if they hang out in IRC and wear scary Guy Fawkes masks, right? Anonymous is not a country. Anonymous does not claim to be a sovereign country, and it certainly doesn't hold territory.
What if they're being backed by a sovereign government, and that can be proven?
Then they're mercenaries.
Yeah, well,
They are hired by that government to infiltrate and attack.
right, so the question was, you all heard it, I'll repeat it for the recording, well, what if they're being backed? Well, what if they're being backed, right? If that can be proven, a lot of things would be true, right? But frankly, if the United States federal government could prove everything it's currently said about the state of cyber war on the internet, we'd live in a land where North Korea is the most terrifying enemy we've ever faced since Hannibal. Probably not true, frankly. But we can assume that arguendo, and I'll talk about it a little bit later. So it's not anonymous, right? It's just not. And we have a word for things that are warlike actions that are not perpetrated by a military. They're called criminal acts, right? But because the law of armed conflict comes from international law, and international law still uses a lot of Latin, we have a really cool word for international criminal act. It's called brigandry, which is a great word. So international people who are attacking things are brigands under international law. They're not committing war crimes because they can't start a war, which is a crucial distinction. So Anonymous can't start a war. And there's lots of people in the industry right now who say, oh my God, hackers are legitimate targets of war. No, they can't be because they're not military. And so Anonymous is never going to be justified of a cyber or of a kinetic response by our military. We are not going to stick a cruise missile down your chimney, as someone at the Pentagon anonymously leaked to the press, because it can't work that way.
Aren't guerrillas considered to be military even though they are not actually military? Couldn't these hackers be considered cyber guerrillas?
No, they can't. And I'll talk about why. That's actually not a bad question. But I'm going to talk about how we start a war first, and then I'm going to get to that principle. So how do we start a war? We need a use of force, which is a specific term under international law, and it does not mean shoving the moderator or John or anyone, right? So a use of force occurs, a use of force has to occur by a military and has to meet a few conditions, right? The primary condition is that it has to, like for the old kinetic thing, it has to cause a bunch of damage, right, to property or to lives. It has to cause damage equivalent to bombing something is generally what's accepted. Which means, it has to be like the kind of thing that militaries do, right? We don't just go in and shoot somebody. We tend to go in and kill hundreds of people, right? Or assassinate heads of state, although assassinations are a problem. Something large. And specifically, it has to meet what they call the de minimis threshold. And de minimis just means a bare minimum threshold. But what it means in international law is very simple. It has to basically pass the smell test by the rest of the international community. And the best way to define this is in practice. A couple months ago, Mexico invaded the United States. The Mexican army took military equipment with guns on it and flew into Texas. Because they suck at GPS. This happens. Some of you watch West Wing might have thought this was a joke, but this isn't a joke. One time, the Montana Army National Guard invaded Canada. Because they suck at GPS, because Montana. And they show up in Canada, and the Mounties are like, oi! What's an entire group of army people doing in Canada. They're like, Mounties are not the kind of police force we have back in Montana. This is not a good sign. And what did they do? Canada did not declare war on the United States, right? They did not start bombing random celebrity families and singing songs a la South Park, right? What happened instead was they took their guns away, made them march back to Montana, and gave them back their guns, and said, use your GPS next time. Because it was a de minimis threshold, right? It was clearly not an active war, because it doesn't pass the vague smell test. And yeah, it's not a bright line. But, you know, one guy doesn't constitute an invasion. One guy does not constitute an active force. It has to be something that you'd think you'd start a war over, basically, right? Like, that's kind of the de minimis test. A lot of these things are kind of fuzzy lines. And in case you're curious with the Mexico thing, a similar thing happened. We scrambled a couple jets. The Mexican helicopter said, those don't look like our jets. We turned them back around, and we put them back in Mexico, and life was fine, right? We did not declare war on Mexico, because it's in nobody's interest to have wars happen like that. So in war, we have rules. And this is one I'm going to your issue. We have a couple principles I'm going to talk about. There's lots and lots of rules, but the big rules are pretty simple. One is the principle of distinction, which is what gets to your guerrilla question. The principle of distinction is you have to wear a uniform. And if you can't afford a uniform, you have to wear some distinctive emblem that holds you out as a member of the military. Those of you who have seen like Les Mis movies or on Broadway or something might have remembered like the big armband stripes, right, or the big flowers. They're variously worn in different productions. Other people might think, well, God, if we have a big, huge, like bright-colored armband, then that's going to be our distinction. It can be almost anything. You just have to be able to see it from a long ways away. And the reason for this is very simple. If you look like the civilians in an area, and some of you are military and some of you are civilians, it's going to be a somewhat more valid military decision to just massacre the entire village, because they can't tell who it is.
Well, that's the Vietcong.
So the principle of distinction is designed to protect civilians. That's the entire purpose. And so it is a violation of the law of war. It's actually a grave breach of the law of war to not wear a uniform or some distinctive emblem. And there's been some debate more recently in the international community about whether this is really fair, because the United States has lots of bombs that can actually see emblems of distinction and bomb them. But it isn't okay to set yourself up as going to be a war that is going to be a combatant, and then say, well, I'm never going to expose myself to risk. I have to be the secret guy. That's never been acceptable for like 600 years. To say, well, I'm going to be just a secret fighter. You have to hold yourself out in order to gain protection under international law. This is why you end up with lots of kind of confused statements. If you remember like the Bush White House, I'm like, well, they didn't follow the law of war, so we don't have to treat them like enemy combatants, right? There are reasons that Bush said that. They're not entirely valid, but the reason is, in general, if you don't hold yourself out with the principle of distinction, you can't receive a lot of the other protections of the Geneva Conventions.
What about the Revolutionary War?
The Revolutionary War had a lot of problems. And everybody gets to point to their favorite war and say, well, that war was special, right? But wars aren't special, and we'll get to that later. We also have the principle of targeting, which means, how many of you ever played Counter-Strike? Or some of the, yeah, half the room, exactly. Remember, don't shoot the hosties? Right? Don't shoot the hosties is actually a fundamental rule of the law of war, right? Don't shoot hostages, prisoners of war, or civilians in general. You have to, following the principle of distinction, shoot only the guys wearing the distinctive emblem. Fairly straightforward. And then there's the principle of proportionality, which says, look, sometimes the bad guys are right next to the non-combatants. And there's going to be a fuzzy, it's a problem, Americans hate this because it's not very easy to define, say, bad and good. But there's going to be a rule that says, look, you have to kill an amount of civilians that is a reasonable collateral damage in exchange for the military objective you're getting. It doesn't mean you can't massively overkill combatants, right? It is totally legal to drop a 20,000-pound bomb on a deserted island to kill one sniper. Totally fine. That's massive overkill, right? But that isn't the proportionality. It is not okay to drop a 20,000-pound bomb in the middle of an elementary school to kill one sniper who may or may not be there. That's the principle of proportionality. Okay? So yeah, there are times when people didn't hold themselves out as non-combatants. That doesn't mean that was okay. It often means that it was a war crime, or would be considered a war crime now.
If they got caught.
If they got caught. But it's amazing how often people do get caught with breaches. In fact, most breaches are not punished by the victors. People always think of... Go ahead.
No, finish your sentence.
Okay. Well, so people always say, well, Nuremberg was always victor's justice, right? And other kind of war crimes tribunals we've had after wars. You can make that argument. There's actually a lot of due process that happened at Nuremberg. But the actual thing is most war crimes are punished by the commanders in the army that committed them. There are people right now at Fort Leavenworth who were tried, sentenced, and committed to Leavenworth for committing war crimes during the U.S. invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan. There's U.S. soldiers, U.S. armed forces, who were sitting there because they committed war crimes. Not always big war crimes, right? Not always massacring 1,000 civilians, right? Often relatively small things, because we punish the people who violate the law of war because we think the law of war is important. Do you have something more?
Yes, I have actually one point. But just so you know, I moved to the back of the room because my microphone is making the speaker over there buzz. So,
Gotcha, okay.
just in case anyone was wondering.
Artificial hissing.
So, I think both of you have very clearly laid out your positions, in my view. One thing I'm interested in knowing is, we're talking a lot about the rules of engagement and such. Do we have any former or current military personnel in this room right now?
I spotted the Fed.
All right, so I'm interested in knowing what you think. You have been in the military, you're in security now, and you hear these debates going all the time. And so, either of you want to take a crack at that? You don't have to, only if you want to. Though I'm looking at my friend Eric Copperthwaite because he's a good friend and I'm kind of a jerk. And
Thanks, Bill.
But if not, I've got plenty more to lay out, which you might disagree with more, and then yell at me more.
So, let's see if I can make the speakers go wonky. So rules of engagement are incredibly important. Whether we're talking about the military engaged in armed conflict, or we're talking about electronic warfare, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you would not want. Well, we see what happens when people don't get prosecuted for breaking the rules of engagement. If you look at the way at some of the issues we have with police officers overusing deadly force at times.
But police officers aren't the military, and I think that's a crucial distinction.
But they have rules of engagement, but they often get a pass because of what's called sovereign immunity.
That's actually not why they get passed, but okay. Anyway.
Soldiers tend to not get a pass when they break the rules of engagement, which means that they will follow the rules of engagement more likely than not.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Having served in the military in wartime, you know that you're going to go to Leavenworth if you kill a civilian and somebody sees you do it, it's deliberate, right? So rules of engagement are really important, but just as important is actually following up on the rules of engagement and enforcing them.
Right.
And by the way, I don't believe that I'm not much of a fan of people who are not in the military or law enforcement trying to pursue electronic warfare themselves.
Right. So that's, I think that's
for some of those reasons.
Right. Well, this is exactly what we're discussing.
Yeah.
Right? So that's actually fine. So this is close to my third point, so I'll just jump to it. So we're talking about rules of engagement, and we can have a disagreement of what police ROEs are and are not later. When we talk about a rule of engagement for the military, the first thing that happens, the kind of basic condition, is that you recognize that it's okay to have a battlefield, and you designate what the battlefield is going to look like, right? Sometimes the battlefield is we're on the road to Baghdad, right? Or whatever, there's some designation. If we allow the military to designate the internet as another force, as another battlefield, another place where we can fight with other countries, we have a problem because there are people who live there. And there are ordinarily people who live in battlefields, right? We call them about to die, unfortunately. You know what really sucks about having your village be a battlefield? You die for no reason. You die for collateral damage. When you're not in the military, you're just the bystander. And sometimes you die for no reason 20 years later. I have a friend who, when he was growing up, was told, you can't play in fields. You have to play on the sidewalk or on certain big streets, paved streets. And the reason for that is really simple, because until he was 10, his country was fighting a particularly nasty civil war, and they filled the entire country with millions upon millions upon millions of plastic landmines, which you can't detect with metal detectors. So every now and then, kids go running and playing soccer in a field, and one of them blows up because of the defensive emplacements left by a war that ended when he was 10. That's the thing. We start declaring the internet to be a cyber battlefield, right? And the rest of us are going to have to live with the consequences. We're going to have a situation where defensive emplacements 20 years later are still blowing up. And we can say, well, how would that possibly work? The neat thing is, we don't have to decide how it's going to possibly work. Every new advance in military weaponry has always brought with it a promise that, hey, we won't still be killing people with this 20 years later, right? That was the idea of landmines. We're going to end the war, and there's not going to be invasions, and it's not going to be a problem. That was the rule with cluster bombs. They're all going to go off. We promise that these days, the bombs are all going to go off. That was the idea with really big bombs, is that there's so much bomb that it will all blow up, and yet we still harvest hundreds of thousands of metric tons a year of unexploded munitions from the battlefields of World War I in Europe.
So let's try to take that and make a comparison, an example of how this happens online. Where's that point where the innocent bystander steps on a bomb that's been laying dormant for years if it's in the confines of
Sure.
cyberspace?
Sure.
I just said cyber. So
let's take hypothetical Stuxnet 2.0. We'll call it Stuxnet, because it's not as good. Stuxnet was apparently, judging from public news sources like the New York Times, and who can't trust the New York Times, was apparently extremely well targeted, right? It looked very specifically for only things that were likely to be in Iran. It was looking for languages and such on. I don't know all the details. It's been a while since I've read them. But the point is, it was only going to infect certain computers in Iran that were attached to certain programmable logic controllers from this one vendor. Let's say the next one isn't thrown together quite as well, right? It's not quite as hyper-focused and targeted. It didn't spend as many years in its development. So it looks for PLCs of a certain vendor, because they could be all over, right? We could have enemies among us. Right now, it blows up a few centrifuges. 10 years from now, those same PLCs, people who work at SCADA notice that PLCs don't get swapped out, right? You tend to have the same models on and on and on for decades on end. 10 years from now, we might have breakouts from floppies or old CDs because, this stuff still propagates across the internet. And it propagates across the internet and says, God, I found a bunch of those old PLCs laid around. Well, I know my mission. I'm going to kill the PLC. But now we're using those PLCs for ventilators or hospitals or things that aren't uranium enrichment devices. And now we really do have a problem because random PLCs, this old hardware tends to stick around. And there are instances of this already happening. There are published reports of Stuxnet having shown up in hospitals and not having gone off just because it didn't pass the final language checks, right? So like hospitals detected it, but they detected that the thing that flipped was that it wasn't in Farsi, I believe, and therefore it didn't go off at the end. So you can easily see a single bit flip, a random mutation, the street finding its own use for things. Suddenly it does go off, and that's the end of that hospital.
So legacy malware has dormant bomb.
Right.
Okay.
Look at Snow Crash or Neuromancer.
So John, I want to bring you back in.
Have you finished your points?
Good enough.
So we've heard a bit from the audience at this point, and I brought in my military expert.
So I was actually very delighted to see Dr. O'Connor sort of go down this last set of paths.
He's being a jerk, and he's acting like it's not. It's great.
It's the art of trolling.
It is.
I mean,
Getting what we paid for.
if there's, again, we want this to be war, right? We want to avoid the situation that's just being described, right? There are going to be atrocities. There are always going to be atrocities, right? Somebody can create a bomb, a cyber bomb. I thought his example was a nice one, and people could be affected years in the future in ways that weren't intended, right? When I lived in Baltimore, I remember seeing an article about digging up mines from the Revolutionary War era, and that there was some concern that they would still be alive. I mean, I think this is probably a problem that's happened throughout history. But the reason that we want to, so when Dr. O'Connor gets up and gives us a bunch of legalese, I mean, I hate to resort to ad hominem attacks to win the debate, but I'm willing to do that if it's in the debate. Right? he gets up and spouts a lot of legalese, and in the preparation for this, I was worried that you would get up and you would say, well, look, the United Nations has made it clear what is and isn't war, and it's illegal to have war, right? We've outlawed the concept of war because we want to make that good and life grand and everybody is happy. So what we end up with are these skirmishes or these actions or these things that go on for years that aren't technically war, or they're wars, wars against concepts, as he pointed out. We want what's happening on the internet to be cyber war, in part so that it will be regulated the way that war is, right? I agreed with the gentleman who commented that we don't want to see electronic operations being done by civilians. We certainly don't want to see electronic operations be done at all. I don't particularly. But if that is in the role of warfare, then, as Dr. O'Connor points out, if you do it, you can be prosecuted for it, right? The police can stop you for it. But even more so, war is in the eye of the beholder, to reiterate the point that I made, right? If the other country feels that your actions are warlike,
We have a question here.
then it doesn't so much matter how you define it. You could get what's coming to you, and I don't want to see that happen, right? I want to see civilians, I want to see security practitioners protected from, in general, the things that happen during war. Yes, sir.
So the point that I wanted to make was, every time we declare war on a concept, we seem to get more of that concept. Examples being the war on drugs, the war on poverty, the war on terrorism. We probably created more terrorists than we've gotten rid of. So how would you say that this is going to be different?
Oh, so if this is Fox News, I am not declaring a war on cyber. Let me be clear about that. Right? I completely agreed with the opening statement that Dr. O'Connor made. War is war between two countries, right? And that's why when I defined what war is for the concept of this, war is a nation acting with intent to violate the sovereignty of another nation. I think the core disagreement here with that part of it is 2 years ago, a good friend and I gave a talk at PumpCon. I should be clear, it was Dr. O'Connor. We were looking at a document that had recently been released called the Talon Manual?
The NATO Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence Talon Manual on the International Law of Armed Conflict applicable to cyber warfare. It has a 300-word title. I'm so sorry.
It's this fascinatingly vague document. It's available online. The various NATO member countries got together and said, okay, what does it mean to have war in the cyber domain, and what are the things that implies? And so in one of the sections where they were looking at it, they said, well, what's the definition of a warlike action? Well, it's when you, and I'm paraphrasing here, right? It's when you cause a physical attack against something or against territory of someone that, and it has this, you hurt them or there's some physical or measurable harm. And the way this document is written is there's a statement like that, and there's 3 pages of footnotes where the various people that were involved in the committee, because this was like 15 countries that got together, all sort of threw in their interpretation of what they meant. And interpretation number 7 said, just because something is digital or electronic doesn't mean that it can't be affected by force, right? They left open the door to say, if you attack data, or if you attack systems containing data, they said this could be considered an act of war in the context of that. So I'm not, I appreciated the gentleman bringing up the anonymous, but I'm not talking about anonymous. I don't believe Dr. O'Connor's talking about anonymous. This is, if you are a citizen of a nation, and you, or a subject or whatever you can be, and you are acting in a way that furthers an ongoing intent of your country to violate the sovereignty of another nation in such a way that that other country can view you as a participant in the war, I'm arguing that we want that to be defined as cyber war because it protects the people that aren't.
But we absolutely don't. The issue with that is that then you have a situation where every Yahoo signs up for their well-disordered militia and says, I'm going to go fight me some APT-1 And turns out that's bad. There's a reason why we leave the war to the professionals, is because they have rules and training and schooling, lots and lots of schooling, and other things that we find important so that they don't go around randomly committing war crimes. If every drunken Yahoo with a Metasploit account goes out and starts attacking China, and then we declare that that's an act of war, then we're never going to know not war. Just, by the way, I want to just address this thing he's brought up twice that I forgot to get to. War is in the eye of the beholder. No, it's absolutely not. War is an objective act, and war has to be actually recognized by the rest of the international community to be legitimate. That's partially a result of the UN, but not entirely. You don't get to say, well, it was completely legitimate for the Soviets to shoot down the Korean flight. It was not. It was a crime for the Soviets to shoot down a Korean flight, because you can look at it using binoculars and notice that it does not say NATO on the side. And before you say, well, they could just not say NATO on the side. No, that would be perfidy. That would be a grave breach, because pretending to be a civilian for the purpose of having warlike actions is one of those things that literally every country in the world is required to seek you out and punish. Universal jurisdiction, universal extradition.
So we have a question and or comment.
Isn't that the definition of war really outmoded at this point? I mean, even since the Cold War of 70 years ago, we had to define something other than what you defined as being a very clear hot war. We haven't been fighting hot wars only. We have obviously some hot wars, but we've been fighting cold wars a lot longer. And isn't this what's going on in the cyber dimension? An ill-defined situation where your definitions just don't apply.
So I think we both want to hit this, but I'm going to start. No. And here's the thing. Every war has been said by the people who were living around it since the dawn of time to be a new war where we're going to throw the law of war away because it's too important or we're in too much danger and it doesn't really apply. Literally every one. You can find people who said, oh my God, Hannibal led elephants through a mountain pass. We can throw away all the rules and we're going to burn their crops, which is one of the oldest times, like, laws against war. Nothing is so important that we get to throw away the laws of war, because the laws of war are what protects civilization. They're recognition that we have to end war at some point.
That's the way it should be. Look at Korea. Did we declare a war in Korea?
But it was a war. It's not about declaring war. That's a U.S., this is the thing that Americans screw up all the time. That's a U.S. political process. It's irrelevant to the international community. That was absolutely a war as declared by everyone in the world except the United States. And what we call it internally doesn't matter. Because what did we do? We sent the military of a sovereign country to go invade another sovereign country. Absolutely hot state-on-state action. It's a war.
So we have
I think Griffin
I
will respond.
don't get a chance to respond to the
Of
question.
course you do.
Come on, moderator. So I don't actually have a very good response to the question, which is unfortunate.
And on that note,
But I think about it in a little bit of a different domain. I'm not a fan of Cold Wars, and I would like to see. I gave my definition of why you would want to have war. The goal of war, if anything, is to reach a state of diplomacy, to try to have a open, upfront.
So you'd rather have people killing each other than manipulation in a Cold War situation?
Well, I'd rather have neither. Like if we're talking about me, there was a second part of this talk that we ended up getting derailed by the moderator encouraging the questions, but I was going to go into some even more contentious stuff, which would further undermine my support in the room. But I wanted to point out that things like government provide for the common defense, government promotes the general welfare. That there are reasons why if you haven't had a chance to read or watch President Obama's Nobel Peace Prize acceptance speech, it was a very fascinating series of arguments that he made, and one of them was that there is the concept of justifiable war. Right? He lives in a pragmatic world. There is sometimes evil from the point of view of him, and that justifies doing things that seems otherwise at odds with receiving the Nobel Peace Prize, and he wanted to sort of get that out there in the open, right? One of the problems that has come up with the way that the government has been prosecuting if we accept for a moment that this has been cyber war, that people have complained about the way the government has been prosecuting the cyber wars. We get things like the NSA snooping and stuff going on behind the scenes and potential erosion of civil liberties, and it's done in a totally clandestine way. And there's no accountability except, there's all three branches of government seem to approve of what's going on, but from the outside perspective, there's, you can't tell what's being done, you can't tell what the effect of what's being done, you don't know, it's pretty obvious when the US invades North Korea. It's a lot less obvious if, China or the United States or Iran, or take your pick, is doing things in the cyber domain of the other country.
You can say cyber is North Korea. That's funny. It'll work.
And so, individual liberty is important. I would like for my government to protect that, but there are other things that are also important that aren't part of the conversation because we're fixating on that, right? Commerce is important. The economy is important, right? My ability to look at cat pictures is important. And what I expect from governments is to be the ultimate arbiter in this space, right? I want the government to make the decision of when they're going to take actions, right? When are you going to bomb somebody? When are you going to take offensive cyber action against somebody? And I want that to be, voted on by Congress in the United States. And I want there to be sort of a clear, delineated set of the reasons we're doing this or this, and these are the things we're going to do to get that. And once that's there, we're going to stop doing this. And so the argument that I would make about the Cold War question is one of the reasons we want this to be war is if we define these as acts of war, then maybe we don't have as many Cold Wars, which I think would be a good thing. I'd like to go with the gentleman back
We're going to
there.
start here, and then I'm going to work my way over to you.
Could we start in the back? Because he's been raising his hand for like 30 minutes, I think.
It's like it's installation. So you're saying that kinetic response is potentially justifiable for a cyber act. So if you've got a group that maybe is helping circumvent censorship in China, we are in some way affecting their sovereignty by helping the people have access to information the government's trying to stop them. So if we receive a bomb as a thank you note for that, is that acceptable? I tend to think it isn't, and you kind of. The nice thing about Cold War is that, you might be on the brink of a real war, but nobody's getting killed, right? So we had clandestine operations going on all the time, and since we didn't actually say it's war, nobody got all riled up saying, hey, let's go kill the other side. It kind of works to allow some room for diplomacy, but if we say, there's a hack, so we're going to drop the bomb, if you're the country to receive the bomb after your country hacked it, it's easy to rile up your people against the nation that actually shot the missile.
You want to do it first?
Yeah, so there's two different issues in what you raised, which are both kind of interesting. One is it's just a violation of sovereignty enough, and I'm spacing, but essentially it becomes a question of attribution is really the issue, right? Like, what do we do when we don't know who it is? And there's actually a question on Twitter about that too. I don't know if that was you. So let's talk about it first. Is violating the Great Firewall of China enough to start a war? No, it's just not. Because this is one of the things, the Tallinn Manual definition, right, that it has to be cyber damage, it essentially has to be property or blood damage equivalent to a kinetic strike. The good thing about that is it does say that, a DDoS is not an act of war. Anti-censorship is not an act of war, right? That's setting aside the whole fact of you can't declare war on your own citizens, right? That's not a war, that's an internal police issue, right? Now we can say whether that's a good thing, there's a whole ethical issue about Chinese censorship, but in terms of the law of war, it doesn't enter into it, right? 'Cause there's no territory invasion. There's none of the kinds of violations of sovereignty that we'd actually like to see for that. The second issue is, what do you do when we can't attribute? Well, now you have a problem. The law of war, as I mentioned, clearly requires the principle of distinction, right? So you have to set out and say, this DDoS brought to you by the United States Army. Which is kind of a problem, right? Because this sounds a lot like the IETF proposal for an evil bit, right? They'll have American military bit packets, right? So there's a question as to what attribution or what distinction really means in terms of ongoing cyber war. But one thing is fairly clear: if you're taking act and you have no distinction, there's just nothing, you're just doing it clandestinely, that's a violation of the law of war. And that's why for hundreds of years you've been able to hang spies, because spies aren't combatants. Spies don't set themselves out as uniformed military. And so when you catch them, they aren't subject to the protections of the law of war. You can just hang them as spies. Totally accepted under international law for hundreds of years. These days we tend not to do it. It tends to annoy the Israelis when we catch an entire group of them. But that is still allowed. So those are the two kind of answers.
So I want to, like, the question was worded in such a way that I could really show how evil I was, and I could be like, I hate bunnies and I think they should all die. I love bunnies, right? I am not advocating for cyber war. I am not advocating for how a nation might respond to a perceived act of war against it. I would respond to your question by sort of non-responding to your question by saying that one of the things that isn't talked about much in the fear-mongering articles about critical infrastructure being vulnerable to cyber attack is how will we or they or the owners of the critical infrastructure react once it happens? And one of the reasons that I agreed to participate in the debate today, knowing that it was going to be a little bit of an uphill battle, especially arguing against a lawyer, which I never want to do again, is I recently watched The Sum of All Fears. Right, I'm a big fan of the Tom Clancy books, and in The Sum of All Fears, the leaders of the executive branch don't take seriously the threat of a nuclear explosion, and then one happens, and the shit hits the fan, and our hero narrowly averts global thermonuclear war through a totally plausible set of actions. And a reason that I want to have this debate now, right? A reason that I think this is a ripe time for us to speak at source, and it's a ripe time for everybody to be sort of talking about the implications of this is, when it happens, what do we do if China does decide that they're going to take a kinetic response to something that threatens their way of life? There's not really a good legal infrastructure in place to deal with that. Will other countries see it as a justifiable response if they drop a bomb on somebody? Will that be an act of war that then causes another bomb to be dropped? I don't know. I'm not advocating for that to be the response, but I'm arguing that given my definitions, we may see that kind of response. And so we'd like to figure it out in advance beforehand. I mean, that's the best answer I can give. I'd be curious to hear more of your thoughts later on.
So I want to get some more folks who have been patiently waiting a chance to get in.
Okay, so you're characterizing the debate as a spectrum between not war on one end, and it's very obvious, and war at the other end is very obvious, with this grey area in between. The negative has given a degree of characterization around the edges of that grey area. I'd like to hear the affirmative clarify what is not war, and what is the most not war you can get before it gets murky.
So she wants you to respond.
How
much cyber does it take before we're cybering?
All the people and what is not cybering?
Stump them.
I'm looking at the paragraph where I actually wrote down exactly this, but I don't think that my answer comes up really well, right? I gave a single act, a single denial of service isn't. A sustained campaign that has a measurable impact on economy or on the quality of lives of another country's citizens or on the ability of that country to compete in worldwide commercial markets or on the freedoms or whatever the core aspect is. I mean,
is stock manipulation war then?
If it's done, so yeah, and I'm a marketing guy for TripAdvisor, right? If there's a sustained effort by one country to violate the sovereignty of another country, and part of that effort involves stock manipulation, then the argument that I'm putting forth is that the other country can consider that one of several warlike actions that are happening to take place in the cyber domain.
So how much war do you have to have before you cross out of not war?
I can't answer that. I think that's an unfair question to ask in this context. I'm not trying to react, but
No, and to be fair, it is something of an unfair question because there aren't bright lines. It's clear at the end, but there's not a bright line, right? There's not a clear dividing line. And
right.
So, to some extent, he's entirely correct. There isn't a clear moment.
We couldn't get a third color, right? So we had to pick one side or the other.
Yeah.
Right?
I mean, to be clear, I don't agree with John on this one. Dr. Griffin, if we're going to be annoying. I don't think that purely economic damage can qualify as an invasion of sovereignty such that it becomes an act of aggression. I just don't think so. I don't think if APT-1 causes the next flash crash that's an act of war that we can legally respond to. But that is an open area for debate, and nerds all over the world are fighting it out on this one, including us, right?
It's also a little bit challenging. Brendan mentioned debate club at the beginning of the talk, right? I think it's pretty clear that Brendan has put a lot of thought and effort into the positions that he's advocating today. It's a little more challenging from my perspective. I personally fall somewhere in the gray area, I think. But I also did not have any problem preparing the arguments for this. I mean, I wanted to, when Brendan first approached me to ask me if I would be interested in debating him on this topic, we realized that there was a little bit of a Star Wars theme going on, right? That here I am, the Sith Lord advocating for, the global hegemony and we've got young Luke over here who's sort of fighting the Rebel Alliance. And so when he was describing that, that no, this isn't war, I wanted to say, search your hearts, you know it to be true.
The thing is, I'm not sure that's the Star Wars character I would be playing, since he used to be my teacher. So I'm pretty sure I'm Darth Vader in this, and I'm about to die horribly, but right at the end.
So to summarize, the last of my points, right? I think it is reasonable to look at what's happening on the internet and state that reasonable countries can look at the things that are happening to them, and if it's a sustained campaign and it appears to be coming from one or more nations that they have an adversarial stance against, to say, we consider these to be warlike actions, right? And so instead of just sitting by and taking it or filing appeals with the International Court of Justice, we feel justified in taking some matters into our own hands and responding to that. I believe that it's the role of governments, or I'm asserting at least that it's the role of governments to prosecute such wars. And the reason that these are important is, again, if you're doing it furtively, you're doing it wrong, right? I would like to see the development and use of cyber munitions to be something that happens more in the open, once you all agree to vote yes on the referendum today, because I think that means that the implications that I talked about, right, the possibility that somebody could be considered a combatant, even if the badge that they're wearing is that they're wearing Cheetos dust because they're sitting in front of their computer in their mother's basement, that I shouldn't be, I'm actually trying to make a serious point, so I shouldn't make as many jokes, I guess. That's what we want, we want to say, this is war, or this can be considered war. And we want to think about the implications of that so that we as security practitioners are protected, but especially so that civilians and civilian infrastructure and financial systems and mail systems and communication systems that could be, in Dr. O'Connor's village that gets taken out, right? That these are things that we say, look, we explicitly want these to be protected. So if nations are engaging in cyber war with each other, we want to exclude these. And we want to say that if you happen to violate these, there is some larger international justice that will come in and say, no, you can't do that. You shouldn't have done that. You need to make reparations to the people that you affected by doing that. And so to conclude, I would like your vote in saying that the state of the internet is de facto cyber war, and that it is the role of governments to prosecute such wars. Dr. O'Connor.
First, I have a comment here. I'm patiently waiting.
Just a couple of thoughts. One is about the principle of identification.
Okay.
The principle of identification does not mean a soldier has to stand in the open wearing a uniform and fire at the bad guy. You can snipers, but more to the point, a group of soldiers can operate from camouflage and ambush, and they still have to be identifiable, but they can hide themselves. So you don't have to. I don't think during wartime the United States government would have to put on the DDoS attack brought to you by the U.S. Army.
That's probably true, but they have to not bring on the DDoS attack brought to you by the Red Cross.
They have to, they can't pretend it's from somewhere else. So I just wanted to quibble about that a little bit.
Yeah, no, that's fairly fair.
But the other thing I wanted to say is I think the real argument here is not between peace and war or Cold War and war, but between espionage and war. And come at it from that perspective.
So to stand back up and talk,
We're done.
He's not done.
I actually just want to point, having done an ad hominem attack, I want to make another fallacy and appeal to authority. So I mentioned an article before, Bruce Schneier's March 2014 article in The Atlantic. So you can find this on his blog or you can find it on The Atlantic. He sort of addresses the point that you brought up, right? He says that there is network attack, there's network exploitation. For one, both of these should be only under the purview of the military. But for two, for the same reasons I mentioned earlier in the talk, because there is no attribution right now for exploitation, spying activities that are happening on the network, that those should right now be considered network attack actions as well. And so both of those things, according to Bruce Schneier, are lumped together. I enjoyed reading his article, and I just wanted to point everybody to that as well for March 2014. Did you want to make a closing statement?
I don't think we're not quite to the end of time yet.
Oh, come on.
There's a bunch more questions. Is my
All right.
concern.
Let's keep going to those. Who is next?
Just a quick comment. In terms of uniforms, we have covert, special ops people who are not working in uniform. We're fighting combatants who are not uniformed. So things like that in our own physical warfare. In the cyber warfare, we're dealing with potential adversaries where there's a major economic impact should they decide to pull the plug and sell off all the bonds that they hold that are in U.S. dollars. Specifically talking about nation states who happen to buy some of our publicly available debt. So there are a number of ramifications that just saying, okay, we're going to fight back in an overt, declare war, etc., has very big economic impacts on our economy and everything that we do, as well as our public relations with the rest of the world. It's not a simple matter of saying, they launched an attack on us, we're going to launch an attack to fight back. Well, we may be fighting back, who knows? We don't know what's going on. We know the NSA has done a lot of snooping, taking advantage of even disk, very deeply embedded systems. Stuxnet is pretty well known in terms of its capabilities, etc. But declaring war is probably going to be pushing things probably one step further than we are really ready for the impact of.
That's I think, a very good point, and it really underscores the point that the gentleman over here made as well about the nature of Cold Wars, that if we look back over the last 70 years of military history, well, now there's an atomic bomb, so we're never going to have war again, right? Or now there's been these atrocities, and so we're going to set up these international things, we're never going to have war again. And the human race just keeps, outshining itself, and we keep finding ways to have war.
Since Hiroshima and Nagasaki, have we used nukes in any war?
Since Hiroshima and Nagasaki, to my knowledge, we have not used nukes in any war.
No, mutual assured destruction didn't eliminate the nuclear weapon either.
Right. And I think that's a. Ed, did you have anything you wanted to say? I mean, that's.
Stumped again.
Well, I mean, it wasn't phrased in the form of a question, really, right? Maybe there is this new class of war, right? And this new class of war is covert war, and it's things that are done without attribution, right? And it's things where collateral damage is more acceptable. This morning in the bathroom, before I left to come here, I was reading an article from the New Yorker from about 3 months ago that was about the CIA's proxy involvement in international student organizations as part of a early Cold War effort against the Soviet Union that was also fostering large organizations. And it was just it was just an astounding article to read because, well, the Soviets are doing it, it must be bad. We can't overtly support this because A, our taxpayers don't want to see us wasting tax money on this, and B, we can't be seen to be giving the Soviets, you know, the credence of what they're doing is okay. So what we're going to do is set up some shell corporations and funnel some money to some people that we've already vetted, and we're going to make sure that only CIA-friendly candidates become the presidents of these organizations so the money gets spent the way that we want, and it was just jaw-dropping. And that's what we did 50 years ago. Who knows what we're doing today? I don't know. But I am willing to stand up here and say the same answer I gave before. I don't like this, right? If what war does is forces you into a state of diplomacy, this is some middle state where you can continue for a long time to have negative impact on people and on economies and on everything without any attribution, without any visibility, without press in many cases. And so if through this resolution, or even beyond the ages of today, right, if we can get to a point where we say that's not an acceptable way to do this, I think that would be a great future state for us to get to.
This question is for the Honorable Dr. O'Connor from the great state of Washington. One of the main points that you've been making is the law of war.
Right.
The problem is that many combatants, and this has been brought up to some extent a few times, don't follow those laws. Just because they don't doesn't mean just because there is no war doesn't mean your village is safe. There can still be enemies that can come in and kill the people and take over the village. There still is no war until another sovereign state declares that they are going to attack back.
Well, so
Now,
there's 2 points there, but okay.
another question that I'd like to segue into. You said that there needs to be some loss of property and/or life. It needs to be blood, as it were. What if there is a group that is supported by a sovereign nation that ends up breaking into the Internet of Things that has been being discussed here for the past couple of days and ends up causing lives of a few thousand patients in the hospital to die? Has that crossed over into a warlike action?
Well, I mean, so there's 2 questions in that last thing, and then we'll go back to the first one. The first one is if a nation state breaks into Internet of Things and causes the Internet of Pacemakers to be Internet of Nothing, yeah, that could absolutely be an act of war. That's a body count. It's actually not just an act of war, it's a war crime because it's killing civilians. I don't think there's any real question about that. The question of attribution is one of, so Dr. Griffin brought up before the state attribution doctrine, or state action doctrine, which is if it is truly an act on behalf of a state, then it gets ascribed to the state. And that's come up in a few different ways. There's interesting cases that I won't bore you with, but about Argentina and a debt crisis, and there's neat stuff. If you can absolutely prove that it's backed by a government, then sure, that could probably be that level. What I don't see right now is I see a lot of finger pointing. I see a lot of FBI most wanted postings. I don't see an awful lot of proof that certain groups are actually backed by their governments. And there's, to misquote a John Scalzi, to misquote a science fiction novella, there is more to life than these 2 sides. I think there are third actors, right? I think there are other groups, and I think sometimes they have their own purposes, they have their own ends. I don't think every possible negative outcome to the United States is necessarily the negative outcome that would be wanted by an enemy of the United States. There are other people who might want, especially economic harms, to befall the United States or to befall other countries. I don't think you have to get to cyber war or just war to get there. But one other thing I wanted to point out, the idea of not everybody follows the law of war. Totally correct. But the law of war isn't like Foursquare on the playground, right? It's not, well, he didn't play fair, so I don't have to play either. And the reason for that is because we have to have something to go back to. if you accept the lost ground of they're not following the Geneva Conventions or the other rules to protect civilians, so we don't have to either, you've given up the only thing that makes war end. And you can see what happens because we have two examples in the last century that dramatically show that. One is the Irish War of Independence, followed by the Troubles. The other one is Israel and Palestine. And so in both cases, you have a situation where there's an original war that's fought by people who remember what it was to be not at war. And there's atrocities, and there's killing of children, and there's burning of fields. There's poisoning of the earth.
Sure.
And you end up in a situation where now the people who are left don't know anything but war, especially the children who grew up, the few who weren't bombed, etc., have never known anything but war. And so they fight a different thing. It's not a type of war that leads to a resolution, ever. It's a permanent war. It's a total war. It's a war of assassination and bombings and killings of unrelated government officials. And it's a war where both sides feel equally justified to commit atrocities. Because every time you have a Israeli airstrike that blows up a Palestinian school, you have a Palestinian suicide bombing that blows up an Israeli school bus, and back and forth and around the atrocities go. And neither side is justified, and it will never end, because neither side has anything left but hatred. We have the law of war, and we stick to it even when enemies don't, because we believe that there's something more important than our current battle, even if it is an existential threat. We believe that civilization is more important than our current wars. So it is crucial that we have to follow the law of war. That's why we fiddle around with definitions, is because these definitions are what we've come up with over centuries to protect having a human way of life at all.
So we're down to the last 4 or 5 minutes or so, and we want to have a vote.
Can I reflect that the premise there? Because technically Israel doesn't think Palestine is a country. Also, the British did not think Ireland. The freedom fighters in Ireland were actually the country themselves either. They were recognized externally, but not actually internally.
But that's irrelevant to the law of war. However, again, as I mentioned before, internal political struggles are not relevant to an external international legal definition of war. It's just, I mean, like, we can fuss around all day about that, about who recognizes whom and who
It's
did
just
what.
like the U.S. Civil War.
Exactly. It comes down to, we don't need to go there. There are still rules.
Okay, so. I don't know, I haven't been looking around the room to see who's put on what tag, but all those who would say that it is cyber, raise your hands. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Not you.
6, 7. I want to make sure I'm accurate here. So I have 7. Right?
Yes.
8.
Okay.
All right, we have 8. Those who would say, no, it's not.
Really? After his incredibly moving statement on how we have to force ourselves into a situation where we get diplomacy? I almost voted for him. Shit.
So that's 15. Who is undecided? So
Platform.
2, 4,
Voted is a binary choice.
2.5.
That's true.
Maybe 3. All right. So an issue that's going to be talked about for some time to come, but this was great. Why don't you give these gentlemen a hand?
And thank you so much to our moderator, Bill Brenner,
Yes,
who we
Bill.
drafted at B-Side San Francisco.
And if anyone has any more questions or comments,
We'll be up
it's
here.
easy to find these guys. I know he does, but we're out of time, so go
Come
up
on
there
up.
and go get him.
So moderator.
Has this been?